Hey everybody, this is video number 2 in a series of 3. So if you didn't hear the first one, there's probably a link in the video description or somewhere. But definitely start with number 1 and then come back here for number 2. So here's the continuation of my conversation with Keith Preston. This is from January 2016.
You've mentioned that the religious conservatives complain about their part in this bargain that makes up the current Republican Party. That the conservatives of the William F. Buckley type and the neocons do not really care about the religious issues which are central to the concerns of the religious right, and that it is the religious right has threatened for many years now, through many election cycles, to basically break up that coalition and sit it out, and just try to tackle the problems of morality in our civilization by non-electoral politics. And it seems as though the neocons would be ready for that.
Well, what's interesting is that, yes, you're right. That's something that's been going on for many years, even decades. I remember reading a book back in the 1980s by Richard Viguerie, who was a longtime conservative activist, and he's a traditional Catholic, and he's very much part of the religious right as it was in its early phase, at least. And he's very anti-abortion, for example. Very anti-gay rights and things like that. And I remember back then reading a book by Richard Viguerie where he was talking about, well, what we social conservatives need to do is split off and form our own party. And 30 years later, it's still not here. In fact, one thing that's interesting now is the way that the Trump presidential candidacy has opened these cleavages. What we see is that Trump is extremely popular with the Republican Party base, what they call their base. Yes, well, as I was saying earlier, the conservative movement that came out of the 1950s and was led by people like William F. Buckley, and then the neoconservative movement that came out of the radical left, they merged probably around the 1980s, and that's really the basis of this conservative movement, this mainstream conservative movement you have today. And now that Donald Trump has emerged as a viable presidential candidate, we've seen a serious split happen between the leadership of the conservative movement and between their so-called base. And much of that gets to the issue of the long-standing hostility or conflict, at least, that there has been between the base, who tend to be social conservatives, and the elites in the so-called conservative movement, who are primarily concerned with foreign policy and economics. The base in the Republican Party are people who are concerned about issues like, say, immigration. They want to reduce immigration. Or they're often fiscal conservatives. They're concerned about things like taxes and spending. Or they're interested in the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Or they're very religious people, and they see that religion is being removed from the public square in a way that they think is excessive or unacceptable. Or they tend to be social conservatives on other issues that they consider to be moral issues, like abortion or homosexuality and things of that nature. And these currents, there's a number of these currents, but these currents really form much of the base of the Republican Party. And these are the kinds of folks that might have belonged to something like, say, the Tea Parties when they started to emerge. However, what we see now is a conflict between the Republican Party base that has really rallied behind Donald Trump because of Donald Trump's criticisms of immigration, because of his promise to take a hard line against Islamic terrorism, because of his purported economic nationalism. These are things that resonate well with the social conservatives and with the base of the conservative movement. The neoconservatives and the leadership of the conservative movement itself wants nothing to do with this. These people are cosmopolitan elites, journalists, academics, politicians, intellectuals, professional people, etc., who for the most part share the social liberalism of the Democratic Party. They may not be as extreme as, say, the social justice warrior people, obviously, and they may at times have some conservative inclinations. But these are not people for whom the Second Amendment is a primary issue. These are not people for whom restricting immigration is a primary issue. These are not necessarily people for whom conservative economic views like fiscal conservatism are really an issue. These are people for whom foreign policy is their primary issue, and maintaining the control of the Republican Party over the state, and in particular having a president that they can control and have access to, which they know they won't have with Donald Trump. They know that Donald Trump's going to pretty much do his own thing. And this is really unnerving to the conservative movement and to the Republican Party leadership, and certainly to the neoconservatives who recognize that Trump is someone from outside their own milieu. At the same time, because Trump speaks the language of the base of the conservative movement, he certainly has become very popular. So it's interesting to see that how the Trump candidacy has allowed this cleavage between the elites of the conservative movement and the Republican Party and the neocons on one hand, and the more rank and file grassroots conservatives on the other. Some years ago, I wrote an article that was originally published at Tacky's magazine on the conservative movement, the post-war conservative movement. And what I basically argued is that the base for American conservatism has largely served as useful idiots for the neocons and for the plutocratic business elites that have always controlled and dominated the conservative movement. For example, if we look at all the time, the half a century now, that conservatism in the United States has actually been a movement, what we see is that they have achieved none of their stated goals except for one. They've always said that they wanted to roll back the welfare state. However, big government is now bigger. It's more expansive than ever. They've always said they were in favor of fiscal restraint. The U.S. public debt is now larger than it's ever been. It's one of the biggest national debts that's ever existed in world history. They've also said they wanted to promote social conservatism or traditional values. We see that going the other way. Now we see that America is a more culturally liberal society than ever before. What we do see, though, the one thing that the so-called conservative movement has achieved is the perpetual expansion of military spending and permanent intervention in other nations in a military sense, building this vast international network of military bases, which the neocons and the conservative movement leadership have always been zealous proponents of. We see that they've been very successful at that, but they haven't achieved any of these other goals as far as domestic policy. And that's why I argue that all of the grassroots level economic conservatives or fiscal or conservatives or religious or patriotic conservatives or social or cultural conservatives, largely they have served as useful idiots for the neocons and for the business elites and overlords of the military industrial complex that actually control the Republican Party and the conservative movement.
Would you say more about the role of useful idiots? I mean, the two words put together communicate something, but it's also a term of art.
Well, the term, as I understand it, at least used in a political context, originates from Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, who was always talking about useful idiots that the communist movement could use as a means of advancing their own interest, and essentially dupes. The old guard communists will often refer to social democrats as useful idiots, or liberals as useful idiots, or fellow travelers or dupes as useful idiots. And that's actually happened on the American right. What you start seeing is a lot of folks out there who are faithful Republican voters. They've got Fox News turned up to 11 on the volume. They've got talk radio turned up, and they really believe in the conservative movement's causes and values and issues. And they keep electing these shyster Republican politicians who are simply representatives of the military-industrial complex, the plutocratic business elites who care nothing about their economic interests, and these neoconservatives who simply are about permanent warfare. That is really the way in which these folks play the role of useful idiots. I mean, it's really ingenious the way that the leadership of the conservative movement was able to bring in so many people from all of these different demographic sectors as dupes for their own cause. And this is something that goes back for decades now. The religious right, as I mentioned earlier, when that emerged in the 70s and 80s, it's unbelievably how they were taken for a ride by the Republican Party leadership. In fact, many of their former leaders, the early leaders of the religious right, will admit to that now. Cal Thomas, he's a conservative columnist that was a leader of the moral majority in the 70s, and Frank Schaeffer, he was actually a leader in the anti-abortion movement in the 70s. They'll come out and say, well, yeah, we really got taken for a ride by the Republican Party, and that's what the Republican Party is. It's this party of plutocrats and neocons that are using all of these quote-unquote conservative causes as a means of maintaining an electoral base for themselves, but which they have no interest in or commitment to.
So with that definition of useful idiots on the table, do you think it's possible for the social justice warriors to serve as useful idiots for the neocons once they have come back to the Democratic Party?
Well, the social justice warriors are really sort of the mirror image of the useful idiots of the right. The social justice warriors are very similar in the sense that they are prone to all sorts of kind of kooky ideas. For instance, among the useful idiots for the right, you have these birthers that are obsessed with where Obama was born and his birth certificate and all of that, and you have people who think that Obama can somehow be a communist, a fascist, a Muslim, and a Marxist all at the same time, and you find comparable views like that among the social justice warriors. All of society is just one big racist, sexist, homophobic conspiracy to keep down women and people of color and LGBT people. That's the worldview that these people hold to. Some illustrations of how extreme this gets. I know a few years back when Stephen Colbert was doing his program where he was, his show was actually a parody, of course, of conservative media, so-called conservative media, but he said something that was sort of intended to be a parody of a right-winger making fun of Asian people, and then because he had this thing in his presentation just as a joke that's intended to mock what he perceives of as the xenophobia or bigotry or whatever of conventional conservatives, the social justice warrior jumped all over Stephen Colbert just for having done this little skit, because they actually took it seriously, and that shows how the social justice warriors think. They're sort of a parody of political correctness. You really can't parody these people. They parody themselves very well, but their worldview is that everything is a racist, sexist, homophobic conspiracy. They will argue that 1 in 5 college students are raped on campus, which would mean that would, if that were true, that would mean that there are about as many rapes on college campuses as there are in war zones and in places like sub-Saharan Africa. You have this idea that all of society is engaged in this one big conspiracy to keep people of color down and things like that. And I think that the neocons are opportunistic enough that they would certainly make use of this stuff if given the opportunity. I think that if they thought that it was strategically, politically advantageous for them to adopt this kind of outlook as part of their philosophy or their ideology, I think they would. I think they could cater to this and pander to this in the same way that they have the religious right or the social conservatives or the libertarians or the cultural conservatives. In fact, we see hints of that now, because what's interesting is that in recent decades, the United States has become much more quote-unquote right-wing in an economic sense, in the sense that we're more plutocratic, more business-oriented. Public policy is more and more oriented towards the benefit of business elites. The old New Deal paradigm has certainly fallen by the wayside, and neoliberalism is the paradigm now and has been for decades. And we see that in any number of policies we want to name. We can look at this Trans-Pacific Partnership. We can go back 20 years and look at NAFTA. We see that more and more business policy, economic policy is oriented towards the interest of business elites. We see the United States has certainly become much more aggressive militarily since the end of the Cold War. The constraining force of the Soviet Union is no longer there. So what we see is these neoconservatives who have come to dominate American foreign policy, and they want to go about waging war all over the world for all sorts of reasons. And while along the way these people have tended to adopt quote unquote conservative values as a type of image or a front or whatever, traditional values, family values, religious values, I don't think most of these people take that very seriously. I think it's just a tool for them. And I think that, in fact, for many of them, the social justice warrior outlook would probably be closer to their actual way of thinking, given that many of these people are cosmopolitan, urbanized professionals and academics and intellectuals. They're not from NASCAR country. And we see some of this happening on a small level because, like I said, even though the United States is becoming more quote unquote right wing in terms of foreign policy, economics, we have this ever expanding police state. We also see this hard left rhetoric being incorporated into the system as well. And more people are losing their jobs, or there's some media scandal or something because somebody said something that was supposedly racist or sexist or homophobic. And in some countries now you can be arrested for stuff like that. I came across a case a few years ago in England where the government was actually doing monitoring of alleged racist incidents in preschools, racism by toddlers or something like that. And as I said at the beginning of the program, all states have to have some kind of legitimating ideology, and I think that as American society is becoming more quote unquote liberal in the sense of more diverse, more demographically diverse, certainly, and more accepting, say, of things like homosexuality. I think that kind of cultural liberalism is going to be incorporated into this wider ruling class ideological paradigm and state ideology. And these social justice warriors really provide a perfect ideological smokescreen just because of their extremism and their intolerance. I mean, they're kind of like a religious fundamentalism. They're like a very fanatical religious fundamentalism where everything is a sin, everything is heresy, everything is apostasy, everything is blasphemy. And for states that want to control speech and thought and things of that nature, this provides a perfect cover for states to engage in censorship, engage in discrimination against dissidents and so forth. Hate speech. A lot of social justice warriors are really big on trying to block hate speech, which of course opens the door up for all kinds of censorship and repression of freedom of thought and freedom of opinion. In the academic world, you see that these people have taken over the academic world, and you see that they've tried to remove from the academic world anyone that doesn't really toe the social justice warrior line in a lot of fields. Norman Finkelstein, for example, I believe, was denied academic tenure at DePaul, largely because of his pro-Palestinian views. He's very much hated by the neoconservatives. But you could see that this kind of thing happens with scholars, academics who are considered.
So I was saying that I don't like the term social justice warrior because people take the wrong message from it. If I criticize social justice warriors, they think I'm criticizing the cause of social justice. They think I'm speaking in favor of racism and sexism and homophobia and whatnot. And I really liked your formulation much better, the totalitarian humanism.
Yes. Well, I can very much speak to that issue because this is an issue that I've been dealing with for many years. Because I am very outspokenly critical of political correctness or social justice warriorism or totalitarian humanism or whatever we want to call it. I am frequently labeled a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, a fascist, a Nazi, a reactionary, you name it, I've probably been given that label. Which is actually a grotesque misrepresentation of my actual views. And I have material on the internet that I've written going back for 15 or 20 years. I've written fairly prolifically about a whole lot of political topics. And if you read the full volume of my published work or my work that's available publicly, which, I mean, not that I would expect someone to go out and just seek everything I've ever written and read it. I'm not that important.
I was going to say, you can never assume that anybody has any passing familiarity at all with the larger context of the words that you're speaking.
Yes, but if you're familiar with the full volume of published work that I have, my politics, for the most part, are very, very far left. For example, I'm an anarchist. I'm an anarchist in the classical tradition, with some modifications, which is about as far left as it gets. And when it comes to social issues, I've actually written before making an argument that slavery reparations for African Americans, as well as land reparations for Native Americans, could be justified on a number of grounds. I even wrote a blog piece like that. I don't know if it's still available online, but I actually wrote a blog piece for that on a right-wing webzine once. I have also embraced the entire paradigm of the anarchist milieu. For example, I have no problem with what's called Panther anarchism or black anarchism, and these are anarchists who are derivative of the Black Panther movement and are influenced by that. In fact, I think some of them, some of the older ones, are Black Panthers, former members of the original party. I think that all of the cultural achievements that came out of the 1960s and 1970s have been good for the most part. I think it's good that we don't have the kind of overt racism against African Americans that we once had. I think it's good that women have the right to vote or the right to have jobs and education and things of that nature. I think it's good that gay people aren't subject to electric shock therapy as they once were just a generation or two ago, or that are not subject to criminalization. I think that environmentalism is generally a good thing. We want to have clean air and water and things of that nature. And there are many things in which I'm much more radical than liberalism or the left per se. For example, I'm very critical of the prison industrial complex and the police state that we have in the United States. Now, that started to get more attention in recent years than what it once did. But at the same time, I've also noticed that a lot of people on the left largely pay very little attention to the issue of the police state, except for the racial disparities that you find in it. Yes, when you see incidents of police brutality where the victim is an African American, or when they look at the prison industrial complex and they see the disproportionate rates of incarceration of Black and brown people, they do point that out. But I go a lot further. I say, why do we have to have this prison industrial complex generally? And I criticize a lot of the excessive statism that is that underwrites a lot of that. For example, for decades, I've been an outspoken opponent of the war on drugs. Like many libertarians, I'm an outspoken opponent of over-criminalization, consensual crime laws, all of these kinds of things. I am a proponent of self-determination for peoples all over the world, including the underdeveloped world. I've always been a very outspoken critic of American imperialism. When it comes to economic issues, I tend to take a lot of very far left views on economics. I'm very interested, for example, in anarcho-syndicalist models of labor organizing. I'm interested in bioregionalism. I'm interested in things like land trust. I'm interested in the economic theories of thinkers like Proudhon, Henry George. I think there's a lot of value in Marx. I'm interested in things like workers' councils, mutual banks, cooperatives, all of these kinds of economic ideas that are associated with the far, far left. Certainly when it comes to foreign policy, I side with the far, far left much of the time. I have no issues at all with people who are not white or women or gay people. I would certainly defend the right of transgender people, the transsexual people, to do whatever they want to do and be whatever they want to be. But that's not what I'm criticizing when I criticize what I call totalitarian humanism. Totalitarian humanism is, to use an analogy, there are two historical precedents that I think fit very well. One is the legacy of the French Revolution, and the other is the legacy of Bolshevism, the Russian Revolution. In the late 18th century, we had revolutions in America and in France that were rooted in the Enlightenment philosophy of rationalism and in the classical liberal philosophy of thinkers like John Locke and some of the ones that came after that, Voltaire and Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the impact of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, was the overthrow of the old ancient regime. That's why we don't have a king in the United States today. That's why we don't have an established church. That's why we don't have a hereditary aristocracy. That's why we don't have aristocratic titles being issued. And the same thing was true in France. That's why France today is a republic, not a monarchy. And for the most part, these were important historical achievements. At the same time, we see excesses that came out of that time period as well. The French Revolution is Exhibit A. In the French Revolution, you had extremists who came to power and became essentially an inversion of what it was they claimed to be replacing. They were very hostile to the Catholic Church, for example. And for good reason, because the Catholic Church had long been a force for severe oppression in France, and not just of secularists and atheists and deists, but also of Protestants and other Christians and Jews. However, instead of simply declaring separation of church and state, they engaged in a campaign of persecution against Catholicism. They developed what they called the cult of reason. They actually built a statue called the Goddess of Reason, which was kind of modeled on Athena and Aphrodite, some of the old pagan goddesses from antiquity. And they built this cult of reason built up around the worship of the goddess of reason. So essentially they did create a new state religion. And out of this came a lot of severe repression. We've heard about the guillotines and all that were used in the French Revolution, the purges of other radical groups. And ultimately, the French Revolution ended with the Napoleonic dictatorship, which was an imperialist regime that was, in their view, they were trying to spread the Enlightenment throughout Europe. We saw the same thing happen with the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution had the effect of overthrowing the old Russian autocracy. And Russia, prior to 1917, was an extremely backward society. There were no opposition parties that were legal. There were no trade unions that were legal. They didn't have free speech or anything like that. You had a deeply entrenched state church, a deeply entrenched hereditary aristocracy, in addition to the monarchy itself, the czarist system. And so they had little in the way of civil society that provided any means of redressing grievances or providing class mobility to ordinary people. So out of that came this revolution that overthrew the old Russian order. And what happened in the Russian Revolution was you had what amounted to a cult, the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin. And this cult, this kind of Marxist cult, came to power, and it repressed all of its rivals, not only on the right, but on the left. They attacked other socialists, they attacked other Marxists, they attacked anarchists, liberals, they also attacked, obviously, czarists and conservatives of different types. And that became the basis of the Soviet Union. This one-party state led by a party that was essentially a cult became the basis of the Soviet state. And then we know what came after that. We had Joseph Stalin, a strongman, came to power and created an autocratic, authoritarian, totalitarian regime that was one of the most malevolent in history, at least as bad as any of the czarist regimes had previously been. And along with that came this expansionist ideology that eventually occupied Eastern Europe and so forth. Um, what we see happening now with what I call totalitarian humanism is something that I think is a prototype for this. We can criticize the excesses of the French Revolution without saying that, well, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were really great people, and what a shame, that they didn't stay on the throne, and wouldn't it be great if France went back to being the kind of absolute monarchy and theocratic Catholic theocracy that it was prior to the Revolution. We don't have to say that to criticize the excesses of the French Revolution itself, or when it comes to the legacy of Bolshevism, of communism. We can criticize the excesses of those kinds of regimes that came to power in Russia and China and other places without being opposed to social justice for the working class or the peasants. We can say, yeah, these revolutions in Russia and China and places like that happened for a real reason. There really was oppression that existed prior to that, and workers, peasants, etc., really were oppressed under the previous systems. At the same time, we can look at the excesses of the Soviet Union or Maoist China and say, well, that's not the direction we want to go in either. And the same thing is true with these totalitarian humanists. We can say that we can look at American racial history and say, yeah, a lot of that is awful. And when the left says that the American system was built up on slavery and genocide, they have a point. Or when we look at the treatment of women in many societies throughout history and in many parts of the world today, the Middle East, Africa, some other places, we can say, yeah, that's a horrendous. Or when we look at things that have been done to gay people in the past, like I said, just a couple of generations ago, gays could be subject to electric shock therapy as a type of cure for homosexuality, which was considered a mental illness. That we can look at that and say, yeah, all of that is awful. We don't have to go back and embrace all of that. And we can look at the cultural changes that have happened since the 1960s and say, well, much of that has been good in a lot of ways. There are many things that are part of the legacy of that I would not criticize, would support. But it's also true that we have to criticize excesses that come from